Thank you, Madam Chair, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. It's been a long afternoon. Can I get anybody a drink? Can somebody maybe give me one? I have Senator Bond here with me. We do have two pieces of legislation we'd like to discuss today. We will be brief, because it has been a long afternoon. February 14th this year, I was sitting in my apartment across the way here. We were all down here for the fiscal session, and I was watching coverage of the shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. It was an awful feeling. It was also an awfully familiar feeling. It seems like we go through this time again, and we always wonder, what can we do to prevent the next one? And I took a hard look at what I had been doing, wondering what had I done, what could I do to prevent something like that from happening here at home. And in watching coverage and reading coverage about the incident over the next couple of days, I heard about red flag laws and began doing some research. Within a couple of weeks of the Parkland shooting, Florida's Republican legislature would pass a red flag law, and it would be signed by the Republican Governor Rick Scott. Within weeks of that, Vermont's Republican Governor Phil Scott would sign the red flag law, and just about a week later, Maryland's Republican Governor, who has an A- rating with the NRA, Larry Hogan, he signed the red flag law. In March of 2018 this year, again in response to the Parkland shooting, the Trump White House expressed support for red flag legislation, particularly citing Connecticut's law, which is the longest existing of these laws in the country. They passed theirs in 1999. And our own Governor Hutchinson on August 15th of this year said that he is open to red flag legislation. These bipartisan bills are popular beyond lawmakers. Polling back in April found that 85% of all adults in the country support these laws, including 84% of Republicans and 83% of independents. And a study done this year by the American Journal of Public Health found that more than 70% of gun owners support these common sense laws. So they're bipartisan, they're broadly supported, and they're not of the agenda of any one particular group or political party. I know they were discussed a little bit earlier, but essentially how they work in the 13 states that have them, they vary a little bit. 30 other states, by the way, have introduced red flag legislation, so they are being discussed all across the country. Essentially, someone is having a moment of crisis. Maybe they're feeling suicidal, or maybe they are looking to lash out, as in the case of 18-year-old Jack Sawyer in Vermont. The day of the Parkland shooting, he texted a friend to say how happy he was to have seen that happen, and that he planned to carry out a shooting of his own at his high school. And thankfully, that friend contacted law enforcement, and when they visited Mr. Sawyer's home, they found a 31-page journal titled "A Diary of an Active Shooter," in which Mr. Sawyer detailed his plan to carry out an attack at his home, at his high school. And that's what prompted Vermont's Republican governor to encourage the legislature to consider this legislation, and ultimately why he signed it. So somebody's having a moment of crisis, somebody identifies that, and they contact law enforcement. Law enforcement comes, decides that there's clear and convincing evidence that this person poses a clear and imminent threat to himself and or others, and they go before a judge to get what is in some states referred to as an extreme risk protection order, known as gun violence protection orders in some other states. And if the judge determines that the law enforcement does have clear and convincing evidence, they issue one of these extreme risk protection orders, which only then allow law enforcement to temporarily restrict that individual's access to firearms. Then within a very short period, that person goes into a court where a judge determines whether or not that restriction needs to be immediately removed and that person's right to access firearms is restored, or whether or not that person does continue to pose a threat and that restriction needs to be extended. But again, only temporarily. No prohibition on access to firearms is ever permanent under these laws. In the case of most states, generally that person is entitled to a court appearance within a period of 14 days. Under the current draft of the law you have before you today, that's just, we limited to 3 days. We want to make sure that, since we are talking about constitutional rights, that we move as quickly as possible, because due process is a very key component of any red flag legislation.